Okay, we're here to talk about micronutrients, but last time we were talking about phosphorus, and I wanted to show you in corn some symptoms that I found from Iowa State. I guess Iowa State could be considered the capital of corn. Purpling symptoms. So this is a normal corn plant grown under excessive phosphorus deficiency. You can see the purple color here at the base. Those are called anthocyanins, and they're showing through. There's not a lot of color, not a lot of growth, so it's a stunted, small, purple growth with no cobs, no reproductive organs. So in turfgrass, you can see where a little bit of phosphorus deficiency might not be a bad thing. We get a little bit of darker color. We're mowing it anyway, so we don't worry about this height. And corn is oftentimes a good crop to use as a model for the turfgrass system where you can see it because it's much bigger. But remember that corn is C4 warm season grass. Okay, on to the other micronutrients. One of the major symptoms of micronutrient deficiency is a chlorosis, a yellow color that is not cured by nitrogen. So you know you have adequate nitrogen, but you have no response to nitrogen, and you have some color difference. So what you have to do in that case is get a little bit of different micronutrients, and probably should have that in your fertilizer arsenal. Like Epsom salts contains magnesium, and if you have this yellowing, preferably on a fairway or on your nursery fairway, you can add small amounts of all the different micronutrients and then see which ones elicit a response. And that's a good way to do that, to see. And also the soil test should help keep you from getting in too much problems with micronutrients. Again, if you're using organic fertilizers or something that has micronutrients in it, you're not usually going to have a deficiency unless there's something missing. And one of the things that's oftentimes missing is magnesium or iron. But iron is used in the system turfgrass so extensively we don't see a lot of iron deficiencies. But I have seen some magnesium deficiencies, especially on very, very low CEC USGA putting greens or coastal soils at the beach where we have salt that's displacing the cations, calcium and magnesium. Sulfur is a micronutrient that we really rarely ever see deficient in turfgrass. And one of the reasons for this is a lot of the fossil fuels that we burn in our cars contain sulfur. This is redeposited in the form of acid rain. So as people are talking about acid rain problems, we've seen some increased growth in forests and in turfgrass from the sulfur deposited from acid rain. So we rarely see deficiencies of sulfur. In corn, you can see it's a chlorosis compared to the normal with sulfur. And looking close, we can see some striations on the veins from the sulfur deficiency. So you might see that someday, but I wouldn't bet on it. Magnesium, probably, arguably the most important, if not tied for most important with calcium. And that's because, as we talked about before, it's the center of the chlorophyll molecule. It's a cation, Mg2+, so it can be displaced by salt or if pH gets off. Sand greens have low CEC, so the magnesium can move through that. Again, low pH will have lots of H+, cations, acid. They can move the magnesium down through the profile. And one of your quick tests is a little bit of Epsom salts, MgSO4. And if you are missing magnesium, probably the best way to rectify that problem is to lime, which will serve two functions. Lime with dolomitic limestone, because that will raise the pH and also add magnesium. So both two things that you really need if you're magnesium deficient. There, and again, recall that the the chlorophyll molecule is made with an iron in there, and then the iron is pulled out just as a catalyst, and the magnesium is put in right in the center, surrounded by the 4 nitrogens and about the 36 to 100 carbons in the carbon chains and a few oxygens. Calcium, again another cation. Again, low pH is going to give you problems with calcium, and normal limestone will give you some calcium addition. And oftentimes the calcium is a very important nutrient. It's a nutrient that we're just really figuring out. When the plant is low in calcium, it's going to be stunted. We'll have cupped leaves, interveinal chlorosis. So you see in between these veins we have yellowing colors. And we've seen this a little bit on some putting greens, particularly when we have lots of rains on new USGA, high sand, low cation exchange capacity greens. So calcium's pretty interesting, and I was lucky to be at Michigan State. There was a lab that was studying calcium, and one of the problems with calcium originally was when we sampled plants, we would put them in a blender, grind them up, and sample for calcium. Well, it turns out calcium volume, calcium rate was all over the place, so it didn't correlate to anything. But they came up with a new technique to microsample cells. So what they can do is take a syringe, stick it into different parts of the cell, pull out fluid, and measure it. And it turns out that the function of calcium in the plant is as a secondary messenger. And between 0.1 and 0.2 micromoles in the cytosol is constant, always in here. In the vacuole, calcium rates can be all over the place. But here we always have that level calcium. And if a cell is touched on the outside or moved, wind, a person, it sends a pulse of calcium from the vacuole all the way across the cell into the next cell, which causes the cell to increase its strength. And actually calcium is the mechanism by which plants strengthen themselves. And because a plant tree grown in the greenhouse, if you put it outside in the wind will blow it right over, and that's because it hasn't been conditioned through this calcium secondary messenger to harden itself. And if there's not enough calcium in the plant to have between 0.01 and 0.02 micromoles in the cytosol, the plant will just stop growing. So it will not grow at all. So we see severely stunted growth in cell division. These cells will not divide unless there's enough calcium to support the cell that the cell's dividing into. So pretty cool microtechnology that I hope we see a lot from and we can use, but this will really help us understand plants and their mechanisms quite a bit better. So for the test, I'd like you to really have a good idea of what a plant cell looks like. The cell wall is hard. That's different from a human cell. The vacuole is also different. The vacuole is like a storage place, a footlocker. If any of those Dungeon and Dragon players are out there, a bag of holding. So a place where the plant takes and puts everything it doesn't want in there. And oftentimes plants that can survive poisons, like turfgrass can survive 2,4-D, it will put that poison in the vacuole and sequester it where it doesn't kill the plant. So nucleus is the same as a human cell. Mitochondria is the same as a human cell. Chloroplasts, where we have chlorophyll and do photosynthesis, are not in human cells. So that's a pretty good test question. How do plant cells differ from human cells? So iron is a nutrient that we often use in the turfgrass system in the foliar form. Often iron can become chelated or not available to the plant from the soil, but we can get a quick greening response by spraying iron on the leaf, forcing the leaf to make more chlorophyll, which is green, provided there's enough magnesium there to put into the molecule. But oftentimes we see that quick response, and it's a good way to mask low fertility grass. We don't want it mowing a bunch, but we want it kind of green. So by using iron and by using low phosphorus, we can increase the green color. In a soil with high pH, calcareous soils, iron is going to be less available. So there's iron in soils that are old and low in pH, so we'll find a lot of iron, that orange color, in Piedmont soils, or especially in the clays of Africa. And here's a nice slide of chlorosis on soybeans. So iron deficiency, and we'll hopefully you probably won't get to see that in turf because we use quite a bit of iron on turf, and it doesn't show up, but it does. We do get an extra response from the iron, so that's a unique thing in the world of micronutrients. So our other metals, boron, copper, zinc, chloride, and nickel, rarely going to be deficient in turfgrass. Sometimes in mining situations they could be toxic to turf. Probably more of an issue for farm crops. We don't want heavy metals in our farm crops, but in turf it's not as big a deal. Maybe for forage, feeding to cows, that would be a problem. Sometimes you need to be aware of these metals. Sometimes effluent, water from a sewage treatment plant may have higher levels of heavy metal in them, particularly if there is industry using that water as their wastewater. One concern in some of the literature is chlorine from pools, but this is usually not a problem. Turfgrass is pretty resistant to chlorine. So that ends our discussion of the nutrients. This is a pretty long section, but it's a very important section, so I wanted to sum things up. In North Carolina, there's been a lot of finger pointing lately. The hog producers have got a lot of flack. They have a smelly product. One about in the 80s, 89, one of the hog producers stood up and said, how about those golf courses? They're polluting just as much as us. And the golf industry wasn't really ready to say something about that for a while. It took a little bit, and then we did a calculation where if you took all the golf courses along the Neuse River and all the fertilizer that they put on the golf course and just dumped it all into the Neuse River, it wouldn't have raised the nitrogen level in the Neuse River as much as it had risen in the last 10 years. So obviously there's something else there. Hog production can be a problem, but we still need to monitor our industry, and we still need to do better, particularly with some of these points that I'm going to point out here. Leaching in a established turfgrass with the fibrous root systems that you've all seen in your pots now, hopefully they're down to the bottom. They're very efficient nutrient capturers, probably the best. They evolved in situations under prairie lands where there wasn't a lot of nitrogen. The nitrogen was all there in the biosphere, so they're really good at keeping that nitrogen where only they can get it. Keeping it from any tree roots in it. You could see in Scotland on some of these native prairie lands, the grass is so tight that no trees can really grow, and part of that is because of this tight fiber root system. But in a establishment phase, you want to be careful not to put too much nitrogen down that would move through the soil. Probably the biggest thing we're going to worry about is nitrogen, phosphorus, or any of the other nutrients moving across the soil. And that's called runoff. And runoff is one of the things you want to be very careful about. We talked about the ponds at TPC. You never want to put fertilizer in the ponds. The other thing is you never want to put fertilizer on the road or on the sidewalks. One of the big problems with our world right now is there's just too much hardscape. Every meter of roof, every meter of concrete, every meter of road, every meter of parking lot accelerates the speed with which water gets to the rivers and with which water gets to the coast where it floods. So hurricanes are more damaging now because that water collects and filters much faster into the rivers than it did when the area was covered with forests, or even better, wetlands, or even better, prairie lands. Don't put excess nitrogen down. It's expensive, particularly with gasoline prices going where they're going. Calibrate your sprayer. If you get fertilizer on the sidewalk, get a broom, get it off there. Get a blower, get it off there. Just makes common sense. So, train your employees. A guy who's rushing to get in 15 minutes early so he can get his Mountain Dew in Danish is probably not as good an employee as somebody that takes their time, sweeps up, really thinks, and does a good job. So I think thinking employees are going to be more important to you, and training them is one of the integral parts of being a good superintendent. So get all that ready. Sometimes you might not want to use a rotary spreader. Sometimes you might want to load that drop spreader so that you don't drop fertilizer where it doesn't belong. It takes a little bit more time, takes more calibration, but in the long run, you'll probably be better off, and I know our environment would be better off. So study this stuff, take some good notes, and if you have questions, make sure you give me an email or a phone call.